Orchestrated memoir narrative avoiding restricted names, applying emotional arc formula. Orchestrated memoir narrative avoiding restricted names, applying emotional arc formula. The morning after the funeral, my daughter stood in my kitchen with a yellow legal pad and asked me, very gently, how much I thought the house was worth. I remember I was holding a casserole dish that one of the churchwomen had brought over, the kind with the cracked blue glaze, and I just kept holding it, not because I didn't have an answer. I'd lived in that house for 41 years. I knew exactly what it was worth, and it had nothing to do with the number she was about to write down. But I set the dish in the sink and I said, "I haven't thought about it, sweetheart." Which was a lie, and she knew it was a lie, and we both let it sit there on the counter between us with the casserole and the sympathy cards. My husband had been gone for 36 hours. I'm 67 years old now, and I've learned that grief doesn't arrive the way they tell you it will. Nobody warns you that the worst part isn't the crying. It's the paperwork. It's the way the world keeps presenting you with forms to fill out while you're still trying to remember how to breathe. Death certificates, 12 copies, because every institution wants its own original. The Social Security office, where a very kind young man explained that my survivor benefit would be the higher of the two amounts, not both, and watched my face fall as I did the math. The pension that I thought would continue and didn't, not the full amount. Because Walter had chosen the higher payout for himself when he retired, back when neither of us could imagine a world where he wouldn't be the one sitting across the table. So I want to be fair to my daughter. When she asked about the house, she wasn't being cruel. She was being practical. That was always her way, even as a little girl. She was the one who counted out her Halloween candy and rationed it through November while her brother ate his in a single sugar-drunk evening. She'd grown up to be an accountant, married another accountant, and the two of them looked at the world the way you'd look at a balance sheet. And what they saw, looking at me, was a 67-year-old widow alone in a 4-bedroom house with a mortgage that was paid off but property taxes that weren't, sitting on what they called, when they thought I couldn't hear, an asset that isn't doing anything. That phrase stayed with me, an asset that isn't doing anything. That's what my whole life had become to them, I think, a line item. Let me tell you about the house because you can't understand anything else until you understand the house. We bought it in 1983, when my daughter was 4 and her brother was a year old, and Walter was making $31,000 a year as a foreman at the plant. It was a wreck. The previous owners had let it go to seed, and the realtor practically apologized for showing it to us. But Walter walked through the back door into the kitchen, looked at the morning light coming through the window over the sink, and I watched him decide. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, the way he did, and that was that. He fixed everything himself. The man could fix anything. He rewired the whole upstairs one summer, working by trouble light after his shifts, and I'd bring him a sandwich at 10 at night and find him up to his elbows in the walls, singing to himself. He built the bookshelves in the den. He laid the kitchen tile, and you can still see, if you look in the corner by the pantry where he ran out of the good tile and had to use a piece that doesn't quite match, and for 40 years I meant to nag him into fixing it and never did, and now I'm glad. I'm so glad. That crooked tile is one of the last things his hands touched in this house, and I would not trade it for a marble floor. And then there was the garage. The garage was Walter's. It was where he kept the woodworking tools he'd collected over a lifetime, some of them his father's before him. A band saw, a lathe, chisels in a leather roll, clamps hanging on the pegboard in size order because Walter believed that a man's tools told the truth about him. He made furniture out there, cradles for every baby born to anybody we'd ever known, a dining table that's in my son's house now. Birdhouses he gave away by the dozen until the whole neighborhood looked like a real estate development for chickadees. After he died, I couldn't go in there. I want to be honest with you because I think that's the only reason to tell a story like this at all. I didn't avoid the garage out of sentiment. Not at first. I avoided it because the last thing he was working on was still on the bench, half finished, and I knew that if I walked in and saw it, I would understand in my body what I still hadn't fully understood in my mind, that he was not coming back to finish it. The mind can hold a death at arm's length for a long time. The eyes can't. So I kept the door shut, and the months went by. It was my daughter who finally pushed. We were doing dishes after Sunday dinner. She came every Sunday, which I appreciated. I want that on the record. She was a good daughter who came every single Sunday. And she said, not looking at me, scrubbing a pot that was already clean, "Mom, we should talk about the garage." What about it? All those tools, they're worth something. And it's just sitting there. There it was again. Just sitting there? I looked it up. A lathe like Dad's, in good condition. That's $800, easy. The bandsaw, more. Some of those old hand planes, collectors pay real money. We're talking a few $1,000s, Mom. And you said yourself things are tight. I had said that. In a weak moment on the phone, I had let slip that the survivor benefit didn't go as far as I'd hoped, that I'd had to put the new water heater on a credit card, that I was eating a lot of eggs. I'd said it the way you say things to your children that you immediately regret because they file it away and bring it back out when they need leverage. I'm not selling your father's tools, I said. I'm not saying sell them tomorrow. I'm just saying it's worth thinking about. He'd want you to be comfortable. He wouldn't want them rusting out there while you're worried about the electric bill. And the thing is, she might have been right about what he would have wanted. That's what made it so hard. Walter was the least sentimental man about objects. He gave everything away. He'd have laughed at me for guarding a bandsaw like the crown jewels. But she didn't understand, couldn't understand, because she was 40 and thought she had all the time in the world. That I wasn't guarding the saw. I was guarding the last room in the world that still smelled like him. Sawdust and machine oil and the faint sweetness of the pipe tobacco he'd quit 30 years ago, but somehow never left. You can't put that on a legal pad. There's no line item for it. We didn't fight. We never fought, my daughter and I. We did something worse, which was to disagree politely and let it fester. She dried her hands and said she'd let it go for now. And I said thank you, and we both knew for now meant she'd be back. She came back 3 weeks later, and this time she brought her husband. Now, I have nothing bad to say about my son-in-law that I can prove. He's a decent provider. He's never raised his voice at my daughter, never given me cause to lie awake. But there's a kind of man who looks at a room and sees only what it could be converted into, and he is that kind of man. He walked into my living room, the living room where my grandbabies took their first steps, where Walter and I danced to the radio on our anniversary every single year, badly laughing, and I watched his eyes move across it like an appraiser's. The crown molding, the hardwood under the rug, the square footage. This neighborhood's really come up, he said by way of hello. They sat me down at my own dining room table, the one Walter didn't build, the everyday one, and they had a folder, an actual folder with tabs. And inside the folder was a plan for the rest of my life, and I hadn't been consulted on a single page of it. The plan was this: I would sell the house. The market was hot. Their realtor friend thought I could clear close to $300,000 after the taxes and the fees. With that money, I would move into a lovely, that was the word, lovely, senior living community about 20 minutes away. The kind with a monthly fee and a dining hall and a chapel and a bus that took you to the grocery store on Tuesdays. The remaining funds would be managed. And here my son-in-law leaned forward because this was the part he'd been waiting for, placed into an investment account that he, being a financial professional, would be happy to oversee. No charge, family helping family. It would grow. It would be there for me. And he didn't say, but I heard, it would be there for them after. It just makes sense, Mom, my daughter said. You'd have people around. You wouldn't be alone out here. We worry about you. What if you fell? What if I fell? They always say that. As if the great danger of being old is gravity. I sat there and I looked at the folder and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not since the early days of my marriage when I was young and certain and not yet worn down into agreeableness. I felt anger. Clean, clarifying anger. Because I understood, sitting at that table, that my children did not see a person anymore when they looked at me. They saw a problem to be solved and an asset to be liquidated. And they had mistaken my grief for incapacity and my politeness for consent. But I'm of a generation that doesn't make a scene, so I did not throw the folder across the room, which is what I wanted to do. I said I would think about it. I said it was a lot to take in. I thanked them for caring about me, and they left feeling good about themselves, I'm sure, feeling that they'd handled a delicate situation with maturity. And I sat alone in my dining room until the light went down and I didn't turn on a lamp. And then I did something I hadn't done in 8 months. I got up and I walked through the kitchen past the crooked tile, and I opened the door to the garage and I turned on the light. It was exactly as he'd left it. That's the part that nearly took my knees out from under me. The coffee mug, still on the windowsill, with a ring of dried coffee in the bottom. His reading glasses folded on the workbench, on top of a magazine open to an article about, of all things, how to build a proper Adirondack chair. A pencil behind the band, saw where he always kept one. And there, in the vise, the thing I'd been afraid of for 8 months. It was a cradle. Of course it was a cradle. My son was expecting his first child, our first great-grandchild, and Walter had started building the cradle the week before he died. He hadn't told anyone. That was his way. He liked to surprise people with the finished thing. It was maybe a third done. The headboard was cut and sanded but not assembled. The slats were stacked beside it, each one numbered in pencil in his careful block printing, because he never trusted himself to remember and he was always right. I sat down on his stool and I cried in a way I had not let myself cry at the funeral. The kind of crying that comes up from somewhere underneath the floor of you. I cried for him and I cried for the great-grandchild he'd never hold. And I cried, I think, for myself, for the version of me that was being folded up and filed away into a lovely community with a bus to the grocery store on Tuesdays. And when I was done, I was empty in a way that felt almost clean. And in that emptiness, sitting on my dead husband's stool surrounded by his numbered slats, I had a thought so clear, it was almost a voice. I could finish it. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where a story like this can turn into a fairy tale, and my life was not a fairy tale. I did not pick up a chisel and discover a hidden gift. The truth is, I didn't know how to use most of those tools. Walter had offered to teach me 100 times over the years and I'd always waved him off. That was his domain, I had mine. But I knew his routines. I'd watched him for 40 years. And I knew one other thing. I knew that finishing that cradle was the only thing in the world that mattered to me anymore. And that nobody, not my daughter with her folder, not my son-in-law with his investment account, was going to take it from me. So I started showing up. Every morning, after my coffee, I went out to the garage and I worked. I started by just sorting and cleaning, learning where everything was, reading the magazines he dog-eared. I bought a book, a beginner's woodworking book, from the bookstore at the mall. The cashier didn't blink, and I read it at the kitchen table at night with a glass of the cheap wine I'd switched to. I made mistakes. I ruined 2 of his numbered slats and had to cut new ones, and the new ones weren't as good, and I cried about that too, but I kept going. It took me 4 months to finish that cradle. 4 months! Walter probably could have done it in a long weekend. I sanded my fingers raw. I got a splinter so deep, I had to go to the urgent care, and the doctor, a woman about my daughter's age, asked what I'd been doing, and when I told her I was building a cradle, She got tears in her eyes. And I realized I was smiling, and I hadn't smiled at a stranger in the better part of a year. And here's the part I haven't told you yet, the part that changed everything. About 2 months in, I was clearing out a drawer in the workbench, looking for the right size dowels, and I found an envelope. It was tucked under the felt liner where Walter kept the small parts, and my name was on it in his handwriting, and my heart stopped, because I thought, for one mad second, I thought it was a letter, a goodbye, something he'd left knowing. It wasn't a goodbye, it was better and stranger than that. It was savings bonds. Series EES savings bonds, a whole stack of them, the paper kind they don't even make anymore, that Walter had been buying a little at a time for years and never told me about. There was a note clipped to the front, just a few lines in his blocky pencil. For the house, so nobody can ever make you leave it, love, your husband. I sat on the cold garage floor and I read that note maybe 40 times. He'd known. Not that he was dying, I don't believe that. I think it was sudden. The doctor said his heart just stopped, no warning. But he'd known me. He'd known that someday I'd be alone in this house, and he'd known the kind of pressure that comes for a widow, the gentle, relentless pressure of people who love you and want you to be reasonable. And so, quietly, the way he did everything, over years, he'd built me a fortress out of paper. When I had them appraised, those bonds were worth a little over $40,000. Not a fortune, not $300,000, but enough. Enough to pay the property taxes for the rest of any reasonable life I had left. Enough to fix the roof and replace the furnace that was on its last legs. Enough, most of all, to take the words "an asset that isn't doing anything" and stuff them right back where they came from. I want to tell you that I marched over to my daughter's house and waved the bonds in their faces. I didn't. That's not the kind of woman I am. And besides, it would have ruined the better thing that happened. The better thing happened at Thanksgiving. By then, the cradle was finished. I'd done the last coat of varnish in October and let it cure. And it sat in the corner of my living room under a sheet, and I told no one. My son and his wife were due any day with the baby. They'd come for the holiday, the first holiday without Walter. And I knew it was going to be hard. The empty chair, the carving knife, nobody knew how to use the way he did. The whole family came. My daughter and her husband, my son and his wife, exhausted and luminous the way new parents are, with the baby in a car seat. And we did the dinner, and it was sad in the places. It was supposed to be sad, and someone said grace and choked up at his name, and we got through it the way families do, leaning on the gravy in the football game. And then, after the pie, I asked my son to go get something from the living room. The thing under the sheet. He came back carrying the cradle, and the look on his face. He knew his father's work. He'd grown up with it. And he said, "Mom, where did this come from?" And I told them, all of it, that Walter had started it, that I'd finished it. I showed them the new slats that didn't quite match the old ones, and I told them which were his and which were mine, and you could see the difference if you looked. His clean and sure, mine a little hesitant, a little uneven. And my son ran his hand along the rail where his father's hands had been and where mine had been, and he didn't say anything for a long time. My daughter was crying. My practical daughter, the accountant, was crying into her napkin. And she looked at me and she said, "I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know you had that in you." And I said, and I'd been waiting 8 months to say something true to her, I said, "There's a lot you don't know I have in me." You stopped asking. She didn't get defensive. To her credit, she didn't. She just nodded, and she came around the table and she hugged me. Really hugged me. Not the careful hug of someone handling a fragile thing, but the hug of a daughter to her mother. And over her shoulder, I saw my son-in-law looking at that cradle, and I'd like to tell you he'd had a change of heart, but I don't know what was in his head. What I know is that he didn't mention the folder again. Not that night, not ever. I told them about the bonds later. Just the two of us, my daughter and me, doing the dishes the way we always did. I told her the house was taken care of. That her father had seen to it, that I wasn't going anywhere, and they didn't need to worry about me falling because I put grab bars in the bathroom myself with my own drill, and they were anchored into the studs and they'd hold a horse. She laughed at that, and then she got quiet and she said, "I'm sorry, Mom. We were scared. After Dad, we didn't know how to take care of you, so we tried to manage you instead. I see that now." I think that's the truest thing she ever said to me. The baby, my great-granddaughter, sleeps in that cradle now. When they visit, my son brings it down from the car and sets it up in my living room in the patch of morning light that comes through the front window, almost the same light Walter saw 40 years ago in the kitchen and decided on the whole rest of our lives. And I sit and I watch her sleep in the cradle her great-grandfather started and her great-grandmother finished, and I think about how close I came to selling all of it for a number on a legal pad. I'm 67 years old. I still live in my house. I still go out to the garage most mornings. And I've gotten better. I made a birdhouse last spring that doesn't look half bad, and there's a whole neighborhood of chickadees that doesn't know the difference between Walter's work and mine. The crooked tile is still in the kitchen. I'll never fix it. People my age get told a lot of things. We get told we're a burden. We get told we should be reasonable, should think about the future, should let the young people manage things. We get told, in 1,000 small, gentle ways, that our chapter is over and we should have the decency to close the book quietly. I don't believe that anymore. I'm not sure I ever did, but I know it now. The way I know the smell of sawdust and machine oil and the particular weight of a chisel in my hand. The book isn't over. I'm just learning to write it myself. And the last thing my husband ever told me, in pencil, on a note clipped to a stack of bonds in a drawer he knew I'd open someday, was that nobody could make me leave. He was right. Nobody can. I'm staying right here in the house with the morning light, where everything that matters to me was made by hand, including, I'm finally starting to believe, the woman I'm becoming. For a long time after Walter died, I believed the strongest thing I could do was be agreeable. Don't make a scene. Don't be a burden. Sign where they tell you to sign. I think a lot of us are raised that way, especially the women of my generation, and it took me 8 months and a half-finished cradle to understand how wrong I'd been. What I learned out in that garage is that nothing in this life comes from nowhere. Brenda and Gordon didn't show up with their folder and their tabs out of greed alone. They showed up because I had taught them, without meaning to, that I would always go along. Every time I said, "I'll think about it," when I meant no, every time I swallowed the hard word to keep the peace, I was planting the seed of that dining room conversation. And Walter, quiet as he was, had spent years planting a different seed. A stack of paper bonds in a drawer, a note in pencil, because he knew exactly what kind of pressure was coming and he chose to protect me before he ever had to. Cause and effect. We are all building, every day, the house we'll one day have to live in. So if I've earned the right to pass anything along, it's this. Be a person of your word, even the quiet words, even the no's, because the people around you will treat you exactly the way you've trained them to. That's the first thing. The second is to keep your wits sharp right up until the end. I almost let my children manage me out of my own life, not because I lacked sense, but because I'd stopped using it. I let grief do my thinking. The day I sat down with that beginner's woodworking book at my kitchen table, cheap wine in hand, sounding out the difference between a rabbit and a dado like a schoolgirl. That was the day I started thinking for myself again. You are never too old to learn the thing you swore was somebody else's department. And the third is the hardest, because it can't be borrowed. It has to be built, slat by slat. When I ruined those 2 pieces, Walter had numbered and had to cut new ones that weren't as good, Every part of me wanted to quit and call it impossible. I didn't. I sanded my fingers raw, and I kept showing up every single morning until a thing that was beyond me became a thing I had done. That stubborn, unglamorous, get back on the stool persistence saved more than a cradle. It saved me. Brenda cried at that Thanksgiving table and said she didn't know I had it in me. The truth is, I almost didn't either. But it was in me. It's in you too. The firmness to mean what you say, the curiosity to learn what frightens you, and the plain grit to finish what you start. Don't wait for a folder full of tabs to find out. Open the door you've been keeping shut. Turn on the light. You may be surprised who's still standing in there.